Greetings. If anybody does come on in the next few seconds, if you can just confirm that you can hear me. So, my name is Michelle Gaza, and I am presenting today for Rise Above, Healing Through Inner Work. And the topic I'm speaking on is the addiction to suffering. So whoever just joined, if you are able to comment, just give a thumbs up or a yes to confirm that you can hear me okay. All right, so I want to say thank you to everyone involved in this event. I really appreciate being invited. I've been able to see a few of the other presentations. Okay, thank you, Z. So I'm just really grateful that this was created and that such wonderful people are participating. So when I was invited, at first I was really uncertain what I would speak on. For those of you who don't know me already, I work with Kay Von Fair and Z Earthstar Healer, and our company is called Activation Coaching. And we do private healing sessions, and we also run an online school teaching people skills to facilitate self-leadership, which means getting the higher self in the driver's seat. So that entails clearing out trauma. We have a whole segment on learning your human design, so you understand your strategy and authority, meaning how your aura operates, how you relate to others, and how you listen inside to get the correct answer in terms of what's right for you when it's time to make a decision. Then we also work with out-of-body experiences and lucid dreams, astral travel. And then the final segment, we've now added Z, and she teaches what's just called advanced light work. So I'll speak a little bit more about the school later in the presentation. So yeah, so when I got invited, I really wasn't sure what to speak on because, you know, there's a lot of different things you can speak on, obviously, when it comes to inner work. This is a huge subject. So I was meditating on it, and at one point I thought I would just do a demo. But I feel like I can do demos anytime, even if there's not a live audience. So having the live audience, I thought, you know, maybe I should do something different. And then it just came to me from spirit to speak on this topic, the addiction to suffering. Okay, so let's dive on in. The addiction to suffering. Michelle, how can I possibly be addicted to suffering? I don't even like suffering. How is it possible to be addicted to suffering? Well, let's just really slow this down, stretch it out, and take a good long look at what this is. Let's look at some of our presumptions. Do you have to like something to be addicted to it? Also, let's look at what is suffering, because suffering and pain are two different things, right? So how did I even, get started on this topic internally? I remember the first time I heard the Buddha quoted as saying that life is suffering. And this really bothered me. It really bothered me because I thought that, first of all, I thought that it was a false blanket statement. You can't just say life is suffering. I thought there's really something wrong with that. But then another part of me was like, well, it's the Buddha saying it. Who are you to question what the Buddha himself has said, right? But I couldn't help it. It just didn't sit right with me. And that was a long time ago. That was at least a couple decades ago that I first heard that quote. So I just really got curious about it. I'm like, well, what is this? Life is suffering. Are we just here to suffer? Is that the purpose of life? So of course, later, I discovered that there was a lot lost in translation. And the English word suffering is not an exact translation to what he is saying. So life is toiling. Life can involve struggle. Life can involve challenges. It can be very difficult to be in such a dense body, particularly for those of us who have lucid dreams or astral travel or out-of-body experiences and are very aware of the other possibilities and how great it feels, to just be the light body, etc. So there is some suffering in that sense, and it's undeniable that there is suffering in life. That's undeniable. But is that really what life is? So as I was thinking about this, I also thought about, I believe it's Pema Chodron who said, we hate suffering, but we love its causes. And I thought, yeah, I can see that. I can see that. But then as time went on and I studied more and I learned more about inner work and what's actually happening in individuals, I realized, yeah, indeed, we hate suffering, but actually a lot of times we don't even like its causes. So one of the first things I just want to mention is that you can be addicted to things that you don't even like. And in fact, I guarantee you there's a bunch of alcoholics out in the world who don't even like alcohol. So how do you get addicted to things that you don't even like, right? That's the question. And once you are addicted to them and you wake up in that position, how do you get out of that? How do you get out of this addiction to suffering? So there's lots of different ways I can approach this, but I'd really like to use the model that I've been using in my shamanic healing sessions to really break this apart and elucidate it, because there's some surprising counterintuitive things that are happening within us that once you see it, it just really kind of breaks something open for you that just really allows you to open up and go deeper in this process and just have just a more satisfying, more profound and lasting experience of healing through inner work. So over the course of my journey as a healer, learning different healing skills, I came across many modalities that were powerful, but I just found that some of the practitioners were kind of bullies. And I was really looking for a way to do this kind of work that didn't involve any coercion and that didn't involve me overstepping anybody's boundaries. I've taught my first yoga asana class when I was 23, which is a long time ago for me now. And I was practicing primarily Ashtanga yoga. And it's very easy in that style of yoga to get very type A and go too far and do too much. Not that that's what the intention is with that practice from the original, progenitors, but the ego gets involved and we want to do too much, right? So that was troubling me. And I was also just really noticing that people were doing this deep asana work. And of course, as I'm sure most of you know who are joining this, trauma gets locked in the body. It gets stored there. So when you're getting into this deep release and stuff is coming up, of course, people were having just emotional outbursts and just really uncovering stuff that was very uncomfortable. But there wasn't really a contract in place to help people move out of that and clear that out. So I just really felt unsettled, and I felt like I love asanas and I see how effective they are and how powerful they are, but there's something that's missing here. There's something that's missing that I need to find. So I needed to make some extra money, and I went on Craigslist, and there was a listing for people who could transcribe psychotherapy sessions. And there was a warning that the content was very traumatic, but the pay was decent and my typing skills were okay. So I thought, okay, I have a psych bachelor's degree, I'll try it. So I got hired, and it turns out the sessions were of a woman who had undergone extreme ritual abuse in a satanic cult that her own family members brought her into as a very, very young child. And she was using this form of therapy I had never heard of. But what I noticed from the very first session is that it was actually working. And the trauma she had experienced was so severe and so extreme that you'd be like, well, she's lucky if she can just hold down a job and pay rent and feed herself. Like, I'm surprised this girl's walking around, right? And indeed, at one point in her life, she wasn't even walking because the trauma had physicalized, So immediately after the first session, I just knew this is what I have to learn. I have to learn. So I found out that the system she was using was called internal family systems therapy. And it was, I'd say, midwived by a man, Dr. Richard Schwartz, who had been working in family systems therapy and had a certain amount of success. But he was noticing that, in family therapy, really the focus is on changing the relationship between family members and getting people out of stagnant roles. And once you remove them from that role, then the energy changes and healing can occur. And of course, there's going to be some success with that. Similar to doing family constellations and, returning the trauma back up the ancestral line, etc. But he was noticing that, in family systems therapy, you're not really going inside. You're more looking at the external relationship between family members. And there was some success, but he still could see that it wasn't quite really getting to the nug of things, to the heart of it. So he had one client, and he was just working with her individually. And she was self-mutilating. She was cutting. And obviously, anytime you see this, you want to stop the client from doing it. I mean, who wants to see a young woman coming to their office with, scars from cutting herself? It's terrible. So you, out of compassion and empathy, you want to stop this behavior, right? So his approach was really to negotiate for her to stop it. And that's what the focus of all the sessions were on. So one day she had a session on a Friday. It was his last client of the week. And she got there and he said, okay, we're not leaving until you agree to stop doing this. And I think they had a 3-hour session or something. And finally at the end of it, they were both so tired. And she finally said, fine, I won't do it anymore. So she came back the next week for her session and she had cut her face, which she had never done before. So in other words, the behavior didn't stop, it escalated. So at that point, Dr. Schwartz, he was just so overwhelmed. He just felt hopeless, and he just really shifted, and he sat back and he said, honestly, I'm tired of fighting with you. I don't know what to do. And also he was a little panicked because, there's a young woman cutting her face now who's under his care. But he really just kind of threw his hands up I don't know what to do. So something shifted, and for the first time he got curious, and he's like, why are you doing this? He started focusing on questions instead of demanding certain behaviors from this client. And because he shifted into this state of curiosity, what he discovered is that she was cutting in order to numb herself from the pain she was feeling because she was being sexually abused by, I think it was a family member. And I don't remember all the details, but I'm sure it was one of those situations where she was either afraid to tell or she told another relative and they refused to believe her. It's one of those situations where she couldn't get help, she couldn't get away, and it was persisting. So what do you do in a no-win situation like that? I mean, how do you cope with constant, repeated trauma in a world where nobody around you is going to help you to get out and get safe? She chose the only thing she knew to do, which was to cause pain purposefully so that she was focused on that physical pain, which, although it's horrible, I mean, think of the anguish you've got to be in to be willing to do this. Although it's horrible to be cutting yourself and that's painful and it's awful, that was actually less painful than the physical, emotional, sexual, mental abuse she was experiencing. And also it gave her a sense of control. When she got triggered, when she was thinking about the abuse, after the abuse happened, etc., this was something she could do, literally, no pun intended, take into her own hands and feel some sense of control in a situation where she had no control. So as he got curious about it, he started to realize that there was a whole part of her psyche that was dedicated to this job of numbing her out. And instead of fighting against this part, he realized this was actually a hero inside of her trying to protect her because, the alternative was, I mean, what is she going to do? Implode, burn the house down? I actually know of somebody who did that because she was being abused and no one would listen to her. And that was actually her only recourse as a child. And for those of you who've experienced these type of abuses, you can really understand how someone could get to that point. So before I go forward, I just really want to acknowledge a lot of the things I'm going to be saying today are triggering, but in no way do I ever want to imply that the levels of pain a lot of people are going through are minuscule or not important or not real. A huge number of my clients have survived ritual abuse, sexual abuse, incest, war, rape. I mean, just the worst of the worst stuff. And I would never want to diminish the extreme agony of those experiences, because that's very real, very real. So once I get into this discussion of how we get addicted to suffering, which essentially is because we don't want to revisit that pain, please understand that I'm not diminishing that experience in any way, shape, or form. On the contrary, what I'm going to be talking about today happens only because that pain is so extreme, that horror is so extreme, that fear is so extreme, right? Okay, so back to Richard Schwartz. So over time, what he discovered is that trauma, and many other, forms of inner work are aware of this, right? Trauma shatters us. It creates like an inner mosaic. Instead of us being one coherent picture, we're many little separate pieces. In more shamanic terms, it's like in soul retrieval, you have shards of your consciousness that are stuck in either different points of this timeline, parallel lives, past lives, future lives, other universes, who knows, it can be anywhere. But what that's doing is when your consciousness gets fragmented like that, that causes energy getting leaked, first of all, to those different points, because as long as they're not resolved, they're pulling energy. Number two, those areas are co-creating with you. So even if they're deeply unconscious to your personality, believe me, they are manifesting left and right and creating your reality for you. And also, it's just extremely disempowering for those reasons and others. I mean, if you want to hold water in a bowl, that's a lot more effective than putting it in a sieve. And having these shattered, pieces of consciousness is like trying to hold water in a sieve, a strainer. So what he found was that when we have trauma, our consciousness will split into these fragments, and certain parts of us will volunteer to take on the role of keeping the trauma and the pain associated with it out of awareness at any cost, including self-mutilation, right? So once he started to see this, that's a huge shift, because a lot of the traditional psychology, particularly the Freudian-based stuff, it's really about, it does recognize, of course, that there's trauma involved, but typically it's just about managing symptoms as opposed to truly integrating and evolving beyond the trauma. And the reason for that is those older systems don't acknowledge the shamanic aspect of healing, the higher self, right? So once you bring in this higher self-consciousness, that's kind of like this magnetic center that can pull all those shards back and restore wholeness and integrity in your system, okay? Now, that sounds very simple, but what we're going to talk about today is the complications preventing that. Because, I mean, hey, who wouldn't want that? Who doesn't want to be self-led? Who doesn't want all their inner children happy and free of trauma, right? Seems really simple. So why aren't we all doing it? If it's mechanically so simple, why aren't we all doing it? So what happens is these fragments occur. You've got the fragment that's storing the initial trauma itself, the memory, the feelings of it, which in the internal family systems approach is called the exile. So think of it, like an exiled child. They're exiled to the basement, to the attic, somewhere out of your day-to-day consciousness. And then other fragments occur that are volunteers that are known as protectors. And there are two types of protectors. One is called managers, and they are proactive protectors. Their motto in life is, it will never happen again, never again. I'm going to make sure I do whatever I can to never, ever, ever get triggered. This is particularly when they're unhealthy. So right now we're talking about an unhealthy, fragmented system, right? The other type of protectors are called firefighters. Those are the reactive protectors. They step up to do their job anytime the pain of the exile somehow gets triggered and rises to the surface, right? So let's use the example of this young woman who is cutting. So her exile is the one that's holding the pain of this abuse by, let's say it was her uncle. It's holding the pain. It's the part of her that actually experiences it. Now, even that part, can partner with protectors that take her out of body during the experience, but there is some part of her that's recording the actual horror of the experience. So that's kind of encapsulated in the exile. When something happens, like let's say, her parents say, oh, your uncle's coming over for dinner this weekend, that's going to get triggered. So the firefighter comes in, which is the reactive protector, to put out the flame of that pain and fear and horror, right? In order to do that, it does the job of self-mutilation. So now, instead of thinking about the exile, we're focused on the physical pain, we're focused on the action. The focus is away from the overwhelming pain that she cannot control, cannot clear out, and the abuse that she cannot stop at that point. She's too young to go live by herself. Now she may, and let's just imagine she also has managers, which are proactive protectors. Their job might be to vigilantly notice if there's any clues that uncle is going to be coming to the house, and maybe the manager would make sure she takes up a hobby so she's gone on the weekends when she's there, something like that. So it would be avoidant. The goal of the managerial parts of our consciousness is to avoid the trigger ever happening in the first place, whereas the firefighters are the ones who step up to numb us out once the trigger occurs. So here's just a little diagram sort of these different parts. Now, the self, the higher self, always exists, no matter how fragmented we are, no matter how severe the damage, no matter how extreme the pain, no matter how horrible the abuse, right? But what can happen is that these other parts can kind of come in front of the self and obscure it. So you get involved in these extreme behaviors, all designed to avoid this pain, right? So it can appear like there is no higher self and there is no hope. And that's really at the heart of what I want to talk about today, of how we can possibly get addicted to suffering. So typically what happens when we go through these kind of abuses, the reason they're so horrible is we live in a culture that, in the modern world in general, and this is across different nationalities and races and religions, the typical modern person is not emotionally very intelligent. We have really been colonized into being mentally focused, to stay mental, to stay numb. If you grew up in America, I was born in the 70s, you heard those commercials, the mind is a terrible thing to waste. It was for the United Negro College Fund. So it's this big encouragement for people to be mental and to be very smart and get lots of degrees. There is nothing wrong with the mental realm. There is nothing wrong with having a mind that wants to participate. The problem is that the mind is numb, right? And the mind is actually incapable of really dealing with what's happening, beneath your chin. It can have theories about it. It can think about it. It can come up with ideas. It can be creative. But at the end of the day, it's not actually going to be able to make a decision about how to handle this because it can't feel. And it's the feeling realm that really is the GPS to help us understand how to get through this plane. So what happens is the mind fragments into these managers and firefighters, these protectors, who again, really mean well. Their goal is that you never get triggered, or if you do happen to get triggered, you don't actually experience the full blowout, right? You numb it out. When these parts are unhealthy, and that unhealthiness happens, of course, once that trauma occurs, you have a split. You live in a culture that's not going to glue you back together again. So you're walking around as Humpty Dumpty. So what ends up happening is we end up in this kind of figure eight where you're going back and forth between these protectors, right? So some people are very strong with the managers. They're very proactively avoiding triggers. Some people, their exiles are so strong, bursting out all the time. So they're ending up in a lot of firefighter activity, which is activity for numbing, right? But either way, the protectors are trying to keep you up here. The whole goal is to keep you away from here. Because when your system is unhealthy, the protectors don't think there's a self, right? So when your exiles flare up, they have to play God, right? They're stepping in place of the higher self to protect you from these feelings. Now, as a coping mechanism, that's great. How can I say it's great to be cutting yourself? Well, what the heck else are you supposed to do if you're being sexually abused by your uncle and you can't leave home? What are you supposed to do? So it's really important to understand that the tactics of these parts, whether it's avoidance or numbing, it's the best they can do in a no-win situation, right? So we want to really respect that the intention is good, even if the effects are not. But what's important to see here that although the intention is good, what the managers are trying to avoid and what the firefighters are trying to numb out, they end up actually recreating those very things they're trying to avoid. Why? Because their whole job is to keep you away from this, but the only way to heal and restore wholeness is to go into this, to revisit this. Now, who wants to revisit that? Let's say this girl in this example, 20 years later, the uncle has passed away, maybe even her parents have passed away. She's living her best life, right? But, there's going to be dysfunction, but her managers might say, well, why would we want to revisit that? Let's just stay busy. Let's just, let's maybe be a workaholic, or let's exercise 10 times a week. Let's just really get overly focused on our children so we don't feel what's going on with us at all. There's lots of things managers can do. And you'll notice that in our culture, in modern culture, they're really rewarded. Like unhealthy managerial activity, meaning avoidance activity, is really rewarded. Our culture is based a lot on that, overworking, not connecting in, not feeling, being very mental. Or 20 years later, this girl might be deep in firefighter activity. Maybe she's alcoholic. Maybe she's overeating. Maybe, she's addicted to pornography or just having sex with people where there's no deeper connection and no actual caring, so kind of self-abusive sexuality. And I just really want to be clear there's no such thing as a normal amount of sexual partners or activity. Everybody's totally different. So that, you can't say that there's a certain threshold that makes it unhealthy. These activities, by the way, they can be healthy or unhealthy. The activity itself is not the issue. The intention behind it is the issue. So you can have a glass of wine with dinner. That's fine. You can have a glass of wine because you enjoy the taste of it and you're, at a nice restaurant and it's enjoyable. Or you can drink 2 bottles of wine because you want to be wasted and just thrown out of this reality because you can't handle it, right? Same way, like regular exercise. It's great. The endorphins, the physical health benefits, it's great. If you're doing it for healthy reasons, it's great. But you can also do it unhealthy reasons. You can become anorexic. You can just overwork your system because, again, you're trying to stay numb. So most people in the world are caught up in this figure 8, which is the figure 8 of avoidance. Okay? It's fear-based. It's hopeless, and our entire political system is this dance right here. Firefighters blaming managers, managers blaming firefighters. So interestingly, typically Republicans are more managerial and Democrats are more firefighter-ish, but now we have a very firefighter-y president who's a Republican, right? Donald Trump is very reactive, The Democrats are kind of getting managerial. So one of the things that managers do is they're like emotionally abusive and judgmental. Not saying anything about whether Trump's behavior is good or bad. That's not the point here at all. Firefighters would tend to be more physically abusive. So managers are like the mind games, psychological control, that sort of thing. The firefighters get more physical. So overeating, using narcotics, blah, blah. On the other hand, managers, they can abuse prescription drugs that's proactively, you know, trying to keep you away from feeling this, right? So again, I just want to be clear, it's not the activity itself, it's the intention behind it, and possibly the extremeness. And the whole point of this is to avoid feeling this, right? The avoidance of this is because there's ignorance that the higher self is there and available to everybody. Even Donald Trump has a higher self. Hillary Clinton has a higher self. Like, everybody has a higher self, no matter how extreme this is and no matter how painful this is. But the problem is that these protector parts, I know it sounds crazy, but most of the time, they literally don't know that you have a higher self. So they are literally stuck in despair and hopelessness. And this is where the addiction to suffering comes in. So let's just clarify the difference between suffering and pain. The exiles are holding the actual pain, okay? And it's very, very interesting because sometimes, and we'll talk about this in a moment, how to get out of this loop, right? And get here where the gold is, where you can actually get free. It's incredible to me how time after time we get to the exiles and they're in pain. They're in pain. But once you bring the higher self energy to them so that they can release that and do the ceremonies, they are not holding vengeance dreams. They're not actually suffering, which is very strange. They're in a lot of pain, but they're not suffering. Why? Because most of them are they're just in the experience of it. They don't have the luxury of the suffering. So what's the difference? Suffering is the avoidance. Suffering is the lack of self-mastery. Suffering is the disconnection from the self. And when you actually get into the exiles, they are so quick to connect to the higher self. Now, there's some exceptions. Some of them feel like they can't trust. Some of them aren't ready. They need to take their time. But once they give a yes, the ability for the exile to connect to the higher self is so remarkable, regardless of how extreme their experience was. So the irony is, these managers and firefighters, they tend to see themselves as like above the exile, which energetically they kind of are. They're like trying to stay away from that pain. But they feel like they know better. And this is so ironic because they're more numb. Somebody who's numb cannot possibly know better. But it's like they have to stay in this belief of I know better than you, because the belief is if we let the exiles get in charge, if we let them out of their, basement where they're locked away from consciousness, they're going to take over the system and we're going to be in pain forever. So we'd rather suffer in this horrible loop of trying to protect, avoid, and numb, avoid and numb, avoid and numb, staying away from full awareness, because we think that's better than getting overwhelmed by this pain. Now, there's plenty of instances where that actually happens. You go in, either you don't know what you're doing, or you're with a practitioner who pushes you too far, too fast, or they're just not sensitive, or maybe they have a manager with an agenda that has an ego issue about wanting to fix you and heal you, so they're not patient. This gets bursted open when your system's not ready, and bam, you're out of commission for a week, you can't get out of bed, you're drinking twice as much, or you're shooting up, or who knows what you're doing, whatever your numbing is. So we have to have compassion that even though they don't see the whole picture because they're not aware of the self, these parts, these protectors, when they're unhealthy, they're really doing this for a reason. Number one, this pain is great. Number two, they've had experiences that when you let this out, it's too overwhelming and you can't handle it. Your nervous system gets overwhelmed. It's too frightening. It's too shocking. Sometimes the exiles are holding literally lost memories that your conscious personality is not aware of. This happens especially with like ritual abuse and sexual abuse. But it can happen with all types of abuse. Some just like emotional incest or emotional neglect. You can have those initial wounds so deep down at the foundation of the consciousness structure you've built that you just literally forgot about them because it happened so long ago. So the key when you're going in to get out of this addiction to the suffering, and the suffering is about the avoidance and numbing as opposed to the pain. So we want to really make a distinction. We're addicted to the avoidance. That's what the suffering is. The suffering is resisting what is. The suffering is not wanting to be here. The suffering is avoidance or numbing. Again, there's no judgment about this. I mean, we're sitting here in the Kali Yuga, there's crazy stuff going on. Why would we judge these parts of us whose intention is to keep us safe and stable? They're like little adultified children. So when I think of protectors, I think of like a little 8-year-old boy wearing his father's suit and shoes, or a little girl wearing like her mom's dress and carrying her purse. That's really kind of energetically what they look like. They're like little children trying to parent themselves because their outer reality, the adults around them, the society around them is failing them. So it's important to keep that in mind. So when we talk about being addicted to suffering, I'm not saying that in a way that's dismissive or that even says that it really could be any other way until you know how to shift out of it. It's like our system is set up to keep us addicted to suffering, right? That's why our medical system is so great at treating symptoms. But a lot of the doctors like actually don't even know the causes of things. So I've had different ailments and I've gone to, you know, traditional Western doctors who just gave me like straight up false information because they just didn't know. So everybody's forgiven. If you've got, you know, extreme avoidance and numbing addiction, suffering addiction, totally forgiven, totally understandable. So let's start there. So how do we get out of this and get to excavating the pain? The first step is, of course, like I said, respecting what's happening here. The intention of these parts is to help you and keep you safe so you don't get overwhelmed by this pain. So really the first step is negotiating with those protectors, asking a lot of questions, recognizing them, saying, hey, listen, you know, I know that you want to drink this entire bottle of wine tonight because you're afraid of this, right? So tell me more about what you're afraid would happen if we don't drink this bottle of wine. Or, hey, manager part, I know you want to work out for the 10th time this week. What are you afraid would happen if we just sat still for an hour instead, or took a bath, or meditated, or maybe did some different type of self-care? What are you afraid would happen? Again, if you're going with respect towards these parts of you, they're going to be very happy to be recognized, and they're going to be willing to talk to you. Whereas, as in the, you know, Dick Schwartz's situation with the girl who was cutting, if you go in attacking them and telling them you can't do this, they're just going to rev up. Because from their perspective, if they don't do what they do, this is going to be your entire reality forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So respect, gentleness, patience, and moving slowly. The fastest way to heal is slowly. It really, really is. If you go too fast, if you disrespect them, the system is unstable. You know, you're going in and it's like, you know what, let's say you're getting your bathroom renovated. You don't want someone to just come in and start knocking stuff out and pulling stuff. Like, you need some preparation. You might want to put plastic sheeting up. You might want to put some tarp on the ground. You might want to wrap up some of your things, take away some precious items so they don't get knocked over, cover things so they don't get dusty. You know, you want to do some preparation. Then you can relax and allow that, you know, work to get done. So it's very much the same with inner work. Inner work is inherently destabilizing. So respecting that and moving slowly prevents you re-injuring yourself. And that's really important. So I love hypnotherapy. You know, I've had a lot of people coming to me asking about, I think it's called EMDR, which I haven't done, but I know that that can be very effective. There's all types of things that can go very deep, very fast. My one caution though, obviously number one, as with anything, if you're going to work with a practitioner, make sure there's somebody with a lot of experience and integrity. But number two, if you're new to the work, I really advocate using this system that I'm going to explain now, because it allows you to go at the pace that your nervous system can actually handle. The challenge sometimes with these other modalities like hypnosis or EMDR or other things that are just going in really far, really fast, is that you can hit upon stuff that your system is just not ready for. And look, if somebody has experienced like incest or ritual abuse, why do we need to have an agenda to get them to hurry up? Why would we do that to somebody? They've already had enough pain. They're already stuck in suffering. So why would we want to shame them or push them or force them? So you don't want to be forcing. On the other hand, we don't want to be in stasis, right? We don't want to just stay stuck in this figure eight forever, stuck in the addiction to suffering. So you go in and you negotiate. Again, asking the questions. What are you afraid of, protectors? And they may say, I'm afraid you're going to get overwhelmed. Well, why do you have that fear? Has that happened before? And they're going to remind you of the times it happened before. Okay, well, what do you need to feel comfortable? Blah, blah, blah. So a lot of times what I negotiate is time limits. Would you give us access to this exile for 1 minute? And you'd be surprised, for some people's systems, even 1 minute is so frightening. And it's literally creating like nervous system havoc in them, okay? So having a lot of compassion for yourself, or if you're a facilitator for the client, that although you might be sitting in a very nice, clean, safe space, the lived experience of that person as they tap into the exile is very much not that. When they tap into the memory of the exile, they're literally time traveling. They are not in present time with you. And whatever that horrible abuse is, they're actually in it again. Okay, so having compassion for that and just having like common sense about that, right? I mean, I've worked with veterans. So having compassion, if I'm going to talk to somebody about like some really extreme, horrific physical terror they experienced in warfare, like having compassion that they're actually going back to that moment is really useful, right? Being compassionate and connected, not being judgmental, and really operating at their pace is actually going to help you go deeper, further, more quickly. So that's the irony here. Going slow is actually faster, because you're building trust with the system that it's okay to revisit this, that they can trust you, the facilitator, or you yourself, the practitioner doing it on yourself. Building that trust, building that safety kind of allows the system to relax and allow you in. So the very important thing to know is that when you're going into the exiles, you want to be grounded in the self and not blended with a firefighter or manager. So a lot of times what happens, especially people when they're first learning this system, is especially can happen with like a self-like manager. So these are managers who they hear about the self. You see this a lot in yoga teachers and like meditation teachers where it's a mimicry of the self. It kind of looks good. It can be very, very, very convincing. But there's something about it. There's just a little hint of judgment or a hint of coldness, something about it that's not quite welcoming. And people can get blended with that part, and it's well-intentioned, but it's this protector manager will go in playing the self. The exile can feel it. You'll feel it in your system. Something in you will recoil. Okay. Same with firefighters. The firefighter might be like kind of bullying, like, come on, let's get this cleared out. Come on, man. Come on. Because at the end of the day, these parts, they hate their jobs. So they want to hurry up and heal this, but they also don't want to feel this. So they're kind of caught in a funny situation. But when I tell you they hate their jobs, let's say your firefighter's technique is to drink alcohol until you're numb so you don't feel this. You ask your firefighter how he or she feels about that, they're going to tell you they freaking hate alcohol. But they're also going to tell you that they don't have a choice. So this addiction is anchored in, is rooted in the illusion of choicelessness, the illusion of hopelessness, the illusion of helplessness, right? Same with your manager. Your manager who's like an exerciseaholic is probably sick of exercising. If you honestly get them to sit down and you sympathetically and respectfully ask them, well, do you like this job? I mean, do you like beating me up every morning to go to the gym from 5 to 9? Do you like that? And they're going to admit that they hate it. The job sucks. But if they let you go even one day, you might sleep in, you might relax enough to go inside and feel this. And we have to avoid that at all costs. I hate my job. I hate getting you up at 5 a.m., but we can't go here, okay? So for that reason, they have an agenda because they hate their jobs, which is understandable. But you don't want this agenda coming in when you work with this part, okay? When you work with this part, you want to be having the self energy. And I'm going to just stop and do like a little brief meditation now so that you can experience that. Because once you like really anchor this in, then once you get permission from the managers and firefighters, your protectors allow you. And once they feel this, they're gonna have a lot more willingness to step back. They may not step back right away. You may have to negotiate with them a lot, but this energy dissolves a lot of their anxiety, right? So they step back and you're going in not with an agenda, but with real compassion and curiosity so that this part can really get the healing it needs. So I'm going to just do a real brief meditation for you to anchor in the self energy. And then from there, once you feel that, a lot of it is just going to be self-explanatory. But from there, I'm going to talk about what happens when you anchor in the self. You get these protectors to step back, to stop drinking and stop exercising long enough that you can go here, right? So let's do this higher self meditation, and then I'll talk about that, what is called an unburdening, which is releasing that exile from their dungeon. Okay, so put yourself in a comfortable position. Now, if you're driving, obviously don't close your eyes, but even if you're driving, you can sink into this. It would be nice if you could be somewhere still and safe where you won't be interrupted. But even if you got children around or you're at work, you can still sink into this. So if it's safe, you can close your eyes and just slow down your breathing. Really long inhales and exhales. Now we've been really mental, so again, the mind is great, and I'm grateful to have a mind that can explain this to you. But we're going to shift now out of the thinking, mental understanding, and just shift into the feeling body. So just become aware. Maybe you can become aware of your shoulders, your neck, your hip joints, your belly, your feet. It'd be great if you can sink into your feet, grounding. If you feel ungrounded, you can drop some grounding cords either through the center of your being or even down through the feet, dropping some cords to the inner earth. And if that's challenging you, if it's hard to feel right now, if you feel nervous about what you're feeling in your body, this discussion can be very triggering already. Just focus on slowing down the breath. And when we slow down the breath, even if you're not some kind of master yogi, automatically your brainwaves slow down and your nervous system slows down. Okay, so we're going to begin the process of inviting the higher self to anchor into the body. And I really want to make it clear that this is a totally organic process available to every human being, even if you've never heard of the higher self. This is something natural and organic that is your birthright. And your body loves the presence of the higher self. It feels incredible. So you're just relaxing and receiving the core of your being. This is not something above you, outside of you, something you have to strive for. This is who you already are. My higher self is who I was before I dropped in to play this Michelle Gaza character. And it's who I will be when the Michelle Gaza story ends. This is your eternal, timeless, formless self, okay? You already are this. So we're just going to, match this resonance and let it sink into the physicality. So on your next inhale, I want you to fill your whole being with compassion and connection, which is the vibration at your core already. So let that resonate through every cell of your being, every hair on your head, sparkling with compassion and that sense of connection to all that is. And as we exhale, we're going to release the compassion and the sense of connection. Release it in the room you're in, or the car you're in, or in your yard, if you're listening outside, wherever you're listening, and just let it start to expand north, south, east, and west. There's plenty of it to go around, sharing it with the entire world. On your next inhale, filling the being with courage and clarity. So if you already know you're connected to all that is, if you already know as the higher self that compassion is the baseline of our existence, it's so easy to be courageous, because at that point, knowing that all is self, there's literally mechanically no space left for fear. So this is a very organic, elegant, relaxed, centered courage. This is not some kind of Hollywood bravado. This is not the ego-picking fights. This is not about being better than someone else or proving something. This is a very relaxed courageousness that comes from knowing at the core of your being that all is self. And when you can tap into that courageousness, there is an incredible clarity that comes, because a lot of the fear and anxiety melts away, or it kind of drops to the back, and the resonance of clarity comes forward. So as we exhale, we're going to release this courage and clarity to the world around us. It's infinite. No need to hold back. Just release it in your whole neighborhood, whatever country you're in. If you're traveling on the ocean, release it out. And on the next inhale, we're going to shift to pulling in curiosity and creativity. Can you feel curiosity in your toes and fingertips? Can you let the vibration of creativity move throughout your being? So, when we know all is self, when we know all is connected, when we tap into the courageousness of that anchored higher self, knowing that nothing can actually harm us in an eternal sense, instead of having an agenda, instead of our protectors being nervous and cloying and grasping and fearful, now, instead of an agenda, we can be curious. All of a sudden, so many solutions become obvious, so much hopefulness, so much light is available. And in that sense of curiosity, suddenly our creativity just becomes infinite, because instead of limits, instead of fear, instead of agendas, we have an open sense of curiosity that opens us to infinite possibilities. And so creativity is just like who we are. We are literally living embodiments of creativity. So as we exhale, let's share the curiosity and creativity with the world around us. Let's send that curiosity to the politicians. Maybe that can just dissolve some of their agendas a little bit. Just release it to everyone who needs it. Okay, last round. On the next inhale, we're going to fill our being with confidence and calmness. So we're aware that all is connected, all is one, all is self. We're aware that the baseline of that self is compassion. Mechanically, there's no space for fear now, so we're in courage, which brings clarity, which allows us to relax the agendas, to be curious and creative instead of forceful and having an agenda, trying to push things. Suddenly now we can experience this incredible confidence, not just in our ability to heal, but in our ability to thrive and expand and experience joy and delight, which is why we're really here. We are not here because life is suffering. We are here because life has the potential and capacity to be joyful and delightful. And when we step into that confidence, we've released the agendas, we've released forcefulness. We're in curiosity, we can become calm. And for so many of us who deal with anxiety and trauma, calmness can feel so hard to come by. So just let your body soak up the resonance of this beautiful calmness, because you're centered and confident and courageous. And you're filled with compassion, and every cell in your body is soaking this up and loving it. It feels so good to anchor the higher self into physicality. So as we exhale, we're going to release confidence and calmness to our neighbors, to our lovers, to our children, to the postman, to the UPS guy, whomever's around. Releasing that to the world around you. So just take a few moments. When you're ready to, you can open your eyes. And before I go to the next step, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions. And also, if anybody had trouble anchoring that in. So some of the reasons you can have trouble anchoring it in is if a protector, one of your protectors here has heard this talk and they're getting a little nervous because all they know is we're talking about going down here. So sometimes your protectors can come in. And remember that the whole reason that these protectors are doing this job, and they've got you in this addiction to suffering, this never-ending loop of avoidance and numbing, is because they don't trust this. Why would they trust this? When the original abuse happened, the self didn't save you. So why would they trust this, right? Wouldn't they be crazy? I mean, especially if you went through some severe abuse where the higher self appeared to be useless and did not rescue you. Why would you trust that? So this is again why it's great to do negotiations, asking these protectors to just give you small increments of time. Would you allow me to anchor in the higher self for 30 seconds? Would you allow me to anchor in the higher self for 10 seconds? 1 minute? And then typically what happens is they agree to 5 seconds or 10 seconds or a minute, and they realize it's not so scary. And one of the other things I also offer in negotiations, and this is very true, I tell the managers or firefighters, if you agree to allow us to go in deeper, to approach this exile, if there's anything going on that you don't like, you can stop the session at any time. And guess what? Mechanically, that's actually true. I don't have the power to stop them from doing their job. You don't either. That's why people are coming to me as clients, because they don't know how to stop this. They can't get out of it. These parts are super powerful, because remember, everything is fueled in the end by this source energy. The self is source, right? So this is all fueled by this infinite energy, and they will go on forever if they don't get, this healing process. So they can be very skeptical for good reason. So negotiating small amounts of time and reminding them that they can interrupt the session at any time if they don't like it. Now, what happens with very severe cases, and I've worked with some super severe cases, like just unspeakable stuff that people have experienced. A lot of times those protectors, they might need to do multiple sessions. And we might get in here, we might finally make it, you know, after an hour and 20 minutes, they allow us to get in here without interruption. And this exile starts to tell its story and release. And then they come in and stop it and numb out. And they say, it's just too much. At which point I say, okay, thanks for letting us have these 5 minutes. That was enough for today. So basically what I do is I show them respect because they're doing this for a reason. That girl who was self-mutilating was doing it for a reason. The part of her that was self-mutilating is not a bad part. The intention of that part is to keep her from exploding and going insane. So if that part says, okay, we've felt enough today, we've felt into the pain enough, that's all I can manage, okay. And I graciously thank those parts for even just giving us the 5 minutes or the 5 seconds or whatever it is. And then you go and rest. And maybe a week later you try again. Maybe it's a month later. The higher self doesn't have any judgment about how much time it takes for you to start this work. The higher self is not in judgment. It's in curiosity. It may be curious about why you're stalling, but it's not judging you. Only the protectors are judging. And they're usually judging each other. The firefighters are judging the managers are judging the firefighters. They're also secretly judging themselves. So that can prevent you from anchoring in the higher self. So presuming that you have anchored in the higher self, the next step is to approach the exile. Typical, you know, the kind of archetypal exile is a young child. But you can have an exiled part that's 27 years old. I mean, if you're 60 years old, you can have an exiled part that's 55 years old. Let's say you had a divorce after, you know, 25 years of marriage in your 50s. You can have an exiled part that's in its 50s holding the pain of that experience, right? So these exiles, you may actually see them as little younger versions of you. They can show up in lots of different ways. Some people are very visual. Some people just have a knowing. Like, I'm not really that visual. I have a 1, 2, and a 5 in my brain, if you know about human design. The 3 brains in human design are very visual. Also the 6 brains, because they start as a 3. So you may actually see a very vivid child version of you. I have a knowing. So I know that there's this inner child that looks this way, even though I'm not seeing like a really bright picture of her. I can see and I can tell you about it, but it's in the sense of like if you're reading a book, you know what's going on, even if it's not a picture book. Some people don't have any of that. They just have the emotional overwhelm, and you know the inner child is there because the emotional resonance. Okay, so I just want to normalize that these exiles can show up in lots of different ways. An exile can show up as a pain in your knee. No visual, no words, no emotion, just a pain in the knee, okay? So with the higher self anchored in, you're going to approach this part of yourself. Now, it's really important as you approach that part, if you start to see other parts of you, so managers or firefighters showing up in the scene, you want to ask them again respectfully to step back, or ask them, what are they afraid of? Because there might be a new fear as this escalates and you get closer to the exile. So you might have to renegotiate. As you're going in as the self, you're being the self. So you cannot see yourself. You are actually going in as the embodied self to speak with this exile. Now, as you approach the exile, I strongly recommend that you start off without any words and definitely without an agenda. You just want to approach this part of you and allow them to experience. One of the best places to start is just compassion and connection, because universally the exiles did not experience that. So you can gently, respectfully attempt physical contact. So let's say you have a little inner 4-year-old, you might put your arm around her, give her a hug, hold her hand, sit her on your lap. But oftentimes, I don't know what the percentage is, so I'll say sometimes, the exiles don't want physical contact yet. They're not ready for it. Now, keep in mind, this is all happening in the astral imagination. You're doing shamanic work now. There's not a physical child outside of you. This is all internal. but it's still hyper real. It's not that it's real, it's hyper real. This is very real. So if the child doesn't want physical connection, just sit next to them. If they welcome the physical connection, give it to them. But there shall be no coercion ever here, because that's just re-injuring a part that's already got, its job is to hold the pain. So you don't want to make more pain, right? So let's say they don't want physical contact, so you're just going to sit next to them and just continue doing the breathing as we just did a few minutes ago. Just inhale compassion and connection, and as you exhale, you can kind of think of it as a wave of compassion and a wave of connection sweeping over that exiled inner child. And you can do that for as long as you want until you'll sort of start to feel a shift in their energy. They might relax a little bit. They might suddenly reach out. They might ask for a hug. They might hold your hand. They might come next to you. If they're already hugging you, they might hug you harder, or they may relax. So be very sensitive of the feedback you're getting from this inner child. After you do that, and you get a sense of it, if you find that it's very confusing and very overwhelming, that's why you often need an outside practitioner, someone like me, to hold the self energy and to kind of steady you through the experience. And if you have questions or get lost, I'm guiding you, because it's easy to get overwhelmed and confused. And oftentimes your protectors, they think they know better, so they may jump in and interfere. But I'm going to talk about an ideal session now, when that's not happening. So you're washing this exiled inner child, holding all this pain. You're just washing them with compassion and connection, maybe calmness, maybe confidence. Just letting it wash over them, and you'll eventually feel a little bit of a shift. It might be subtle, it might be huge. And then just tell them you really want to get to know their experience. You really want to know how they are feeling. You really want to know what it was like for them. What happened? A lot of times it's good to ask them, do you feel like I really get it? Because by the time you get to the exile, a lot of times you've already gotten flashbacks and you already kind of know what the issue is. Sometimes you can get into the exile, and particularly with suppressed memories, you can literally get there and not know what you're going to find. That's a little more rare, except for in extreme cases of abuse. That often happens. Like, you're like, oh, whoa, she's showing me something I'd totally forgotten about. So that can happen too. So again, staying anchored in the self, where you're curious and courageous, it helps immensely, because you can stay solidly present regardless of what the exile brings up. That is incredibly important, because what's happened for this exile in the past is that nobody was doing that for them. Nobody was staying present. Nobody was staying connected. Nobody gave them an opportunity to fully express what they're feeling, what they're fearing, what they're sensing, what they're not getting, what they don't want, etc. So as the higher self, when you're connecting with this part, you want to respectfully and lovingly give them total open mic to express whatever they need to express, however they need to express it. If they need to scream, if they need to cry, if they need to punch things. A lot of times, honestly, that stuff is going to come when you get to unburdening these parts, which is later on in the process, and I'll talk about why in a moment. They tend to actually have a lot more anguish, because they're suppressing how they feel while this part is holding the pain, right? They can't stop doing what they're doing until this is healed. Their whole job is based on this pain being unresolved. Once this pain is resolved, they can finally start to heal themselves as well. What happens so surprisingly with the exiles, it really surprises me every time. Sometimes a client will come and the exile will cry a little bit. It will tell its story of abuse or neglect or abandonment. And it's sad and it has feelings. But it's surprising to me how quick and simple it is. Sometimes they're holding a lot of pain and rage, and it's quite a big thing, and the client is shaking and there's a lot of stuff going on. And that's also just as normal with extreme abuse. In a lot of situations though, the exile is just, it's just very quick to tell the story, quick to release it, because keep in mind, it's been sitting in a dungeon for years holding this. So it just wants to get out, right? So the irony is, you get there and all this avoidance and numbing, avoidance and numbing, avoidance and numbing that can go on for decades. Once you actually get in here, the healing can happen in like 3 minutes. So that's what's so ironic about our addiction to suffering. We're afraid of the pain. We're afraid to feel the pain. We're afraid of getting overwhelmed by the pain. That fear is well-founded, because if you're doing this without the higher self's involvement, that pain is going to get overwhelming. You're going to get in a huge knot. But once you anchor in the higher self and you do the unburdening of the exile with the presence of the higher self at the center of it, it is astonishing how quick and light and simple and actually joyful it can be. I mean, I still get surprised. Again, if the exile needs to really sob and cry, that is also normal. But it's surprising how often they don't even need that, and they'll just say, it was really sad, it sucks, I want to go ride unicorns now, right? So once you're here, just to review, you're going to start with no agenda. You're approaching this inner child that's holding this painful memory. You're just going to breathe compassion and connection. Maybe add some calmness, maybe add some curiosity, maybe let them feel your courage. Okay? Then you invite them to tell you, show you, release, feel, express, and you're not interrupting that at all, right? So the interrupters would be these guys getting afraid. Now, if they show up in the scene or you stop feeling connected to this, you got to go back to negotiating. Hey guys, what are you afraid of? This exile is finally getting a chance to get some help. Won't you let this exile get help? What would it be like if this exile were free and you didn't have to do this job anymore? That's another great question to ask them. What would it be like if this pain wasn't here anymore and you didn't have to drink us to death every weekend or work us to death every week? What would that be like? Now, a lot of times are so identified with their job of avoiding and numbing, they literally think they will not exist if they're not doing that job. So there becomes a very weird confusion here, because it's like, okay, I hate my job of working out 10 times a week or drinking 2 bottles of wine every night. I'd hate that job. But I am that job. That's all I am. So yeah, I'm open to helping the exile, but if the exile gets healed and I don't have to do this job anymore, I'm just going to disappear from the reality. So it's very important to let all of your parts know, including even the most extreme protectors, including a self-mutilating protector, for example. They can do something else once that exile is healed. They will not cease to exist. We are not trying to get rid of them. We are trying to free them and empower them and help them to see that they can trust the higher self to take over. And when the higher self takes over, they don't have to do their job anymore. So let's start with shifting the exile out of their job, right? So the exile's job is holding the pain of the original trauma. So you approach them, no agenda, breathing with compassion and connection, asking lots of questions, giving lots of opportunity for them to release, express. Once they've expressed their story, even if you think they're complete, always ask, does that feel complete? Do you feel like I really get it? Because the thing is, sometimes there's just little subtle things or things you didn't know that they just need to express, or some other component that just needs to get expressed. So always asking, always giving that opportunity. Now keep in mind, this whole segment can be 3 to 5 minutes. It may not even take a long time. Let them express. Have you told the full story? Yes, that's my full story. Do you feel like I really get it? Yes, I feel like you really get it now. Now that you've released this, do you feel ready to experience something else? And the exile, usually, not always, already knows they want to go paint, they want to go sing, they want to go fly with the fairies, they want to slide down rainbows, they want to go dance. They want to be in charge of loving everybody more. You know, they basically want to get back into the joyful, delightful things that by birthright they're meant to be doing, right? Now, if there's a glitch, and you know, a lot of times even if there's not a glitch, I offer this across the board every single time, because this sort of alchemy is really helpful to like get every last bit of the stuff out. So I offer them before they go to switch to a new experience, a new job, whether it's riding unicorns or being in charge of loving everybody, you know, I offer them an alchemy ceremony. So this ceremony would involve using any of the elements. So it can be the earth elements, including earth, wood, metal, fire, water, or air and wind, right? I offer them to use one of the elements or several of the elements to basically transmute this pain and these memories they were holding. And I explain to them that what's great about that is, number one, they'll be done with it forever. I mean, sheesh, they already had the pain, they already had the experience, so they don't need to do it again, number one. Number two, they're not going to lose the memories or lose the hard-earned wisdom, so they'll keep the wisdom. Number three, they won't pass this on to someone else. So in this transmuting using the elements basically suck this stuff up, turn it into fertilizer, turn the crap into flowers, essentially, right? So sometimes the exile is like, I don't even need that, I'm done, where's my unicorn? Sometimes the exile knows they want to do it, and right away they're like fire or earth, or they want to use wind and water, whatever it is. You can always trust that the exile will know the ceremony they need. All of these parts, even though from the outside looking in, some of their behavior can look crazy, they always have actually a lot of wisdom. We just may not understand what's motivating them because we don't understand the genesis of their behavior. But they always have a lot of wisdom and intelligence. So when the exile says, you know, I want to use water for my alchemy ceremony, all my job is to hold space, and then you, as your higher self in the scene, you go with them and you witness the ceremony. It may take 5 minutes, it may take 15 minutes. The 15-minute ones, honestly, are very rare. I mean, I can probably count on 1 or 2 hands the times that we had to even go past 10 minutes. Most people, it's a few minutes. So again, the irony of this addiction to the numbing and avoidance is really amazing, because the most horrible things, the most horrible memories can be healed in a very short amount of time. It's our resistance, it's our fear, it's our hopelessness, it's our lack of belief, our lack of faith that it can be healed that's actually making it take so long. And I'm guilty of this myself. There's plenty of stuff that I want to avoid, right? So typically you go in, the ceremony is a few minutes, but also keep in mind, this is all shamanic work. So this is happening astrally. So a lot of stuff is happening because you're not in this dense physical reality. You're in the energetic realm. And then once that alchemy ceremony is done, then I ask, you know, do you feel complete? Would you like to go and experience something else? And then the exile can show you what it wants to do. Sometimes the exile wants to go roller skating. Sometimes the exile wants to go, you know, visit another planet or something. So if the exile requests to do something that's practical and physical, after your work, if you can actually go and physically do that activity, that is ideal. Now, if the exile wants to go and ride unicorns, you know, I'm still open that you might be able to find a real life unicorn in this reality, but barring that, you know, you may want to get a photo or a drawing, an image of a unicorn, and put that in a permanent place in your house. You know, there's lots of things you can do as a substitute if the physical activity is something that's not practical in this reality. And then a very important thing, and we do that to just honor the reality of the work that the exile did, to honor the reality of their experience, to honor their courage and bravery to do this work. So it can be an image, it can be, you could buy a physical unicorn figurine, etc. Something to commemorate if you can't actually physically engage in the activity. And then a very important question at the end before you close the session is to directly ask this exile. Even after now they've gone through all this alchemy, they're clear, they're free, they're light. Do you feel confident that you can connect with, and you're speaking now as the higher self, with me, the higher self, at any time? Do you feel confident you can connect with me anytime you need me? Most of the time at that point, the exile will say yes. Sometimes the exile is still not confident. At that point, you negotiate some sort of regular check-ins with that part of yourself, okay? So it might be that you agree every morning when you brush your teeth, you're going to check in and just be like, hey, hey, little boy, hey, little girl, whatever it is, how are you feeling? What do you need? What's going on? What are you experiencing? And they may need to do that for a period of a few weeks until they know that they can trust you, the higher self. Until they know that they can trust you to not let managers and firefighters keep you distracted so you're not listening, right? You might agree that every Sunday you have an hour where you just sit and meditate and talk with this exile. There's a lot of different ways, but it's really important that whatever meeting you negotiate, whatever that is, that it's something you can actually follow through with. Because the worst thing you can do is to go through a huge ceremony like this, negotiate for all this trust, get this exile to trust you, have this huge opening, and then you drop them. That's horrible. Just as in a real relationship. Like if you made a new friend at work and you guys are really getting along and like you're meeting for coffee, blah, blah, and then one day you say you're going to meet and you just don't show up and you don't call and you don't apologize and you act like nothing happened. It's just, that's not going to feel good. It's the same thing when we're working with our inner children, whether they're managers or firefighters or exiles. So the follow through is really important. But one thing that also typically happens when you go through this process is that when the exile was holding the pain and holding the wound, that part of you was co-creating with you, right? So let's say you had, an abusive father, or let's talk about a boy because we're talking about sort of girl stuff. Let's say you were a guy and your mom was like super abusive to you or maybe super judgmental. So that exile is actually going to attract women or partners, or if you're not heterosexual, you can even attract men into your life. If you're a man who's, attracted to men and you had an abusive mom, you can attract men into your life who are going to behave the same way your mother did. Now, why, if you went through that abuse before, why would you keep recreating it? Why would you be addicted to that suffering? Well, because in its own way, the exile is trying to repeat that situation with the hopes that somehow this time they will love you. Somehow this time the abuse will stop. Somehow this time it will be different, right? So what they're really looking for, which they don't know is possible, is for the self to come in and clear all that out. But if you don't know this exists, and remember, a lot of these parts, they actually don't know there's a higher self. I mean, that's so literal. I can't stress it enough. They don't know that this is possible, right? So they're desperate. So this part of you can be desperate enough to just keep attracting people who are abusive, hoping that this time you'll get the love you wanted. This time they'll treat you right. This time they won't hurt you. So now that you've brought the higher self in and released the exile from the doom and gloom, and now they're riding unicorns or whatever, that part can now co-create with you, creating magical, beautiful, satisfying, joyful, successful, peaceful, delightful experiences, right? With joy and delight. And you can literally experience manifestations of this like in the first 24 hours after you do it. I remember one of my clients who experienced really, really, really very, very severe abuse. She did a session, and when the exile was unburdened and did the alchemy ceremony, afterwards the exile asked to go and swim with dolphins. And she didn't have access where she lived to actually go physically do that. So, we talked about some options of, getting images of dolphins or something. And that was the end of the session. And she contacted me the next day and she said, after the session, I had to take my children. I think it was like a Best Buy, some random place. She had to go run an errand with them. And one of her children had to go to the bathroom. And they went in the bathroom and it was covered in dolphin decals. So it's very common that you manifest little winks from the reality after you do this work, because just as these parts have the capacity to co-create abuse and suffering, they equally have the capacity to create beauty and joy and love and connection and creative, satisfying experiences. So it's really worth, working through this resistance to get down to the core of what's happening so that you can finally experience that life is not suffering. Life can be suffering. We can get addicted to suffering because we're avoiding and numbing simply because we've just never been taught how to get out of that loop. So the next time, if any of you come across political debates or you get involved in that, I want you to just really watch what's happening and consider what part of that person is talking. Is it a manager? Is it a firefighter? Is it even an exile? Because sometimes exiles can take over a person. They can blend with that. Is this politician self-led? Probably not. Is this politician run by a manager? Maybe even a self-like manager? Possibly. Is this politician very firefightery and reactive? Possibly. But you typically don't see a lot of self-leadership in these politicians. So, it really begs the question, why are we giving them so much attention and importance? All they are offering is this. That's all they're offering. Politics is completely about avoiding what's really the problem. It's a total distraction from the actual healing that humanity needs. It doesn't even believe in a higher self, right? And you can like Marianne Williamson or not, but just the fact that she's in the arena, touching on more higher self-based themes like compassion, like connecting with the heart, like feeling certain ways, something to do with feeling and love, it's very threatening to these parts who are running the political arena, because the whole political arena is about being mental, being numb, being disconnected, being separate, right and wrong, winners and losers. It's totally devoid of the self, right? And it's not just politics. I mean, you can see this all around your life. You can see this in the corporate world. You can see this on a condo board meeting. You can see this, if your children play soccer, it may come up. There's all types of places where you're going to see that figure 8 of avoidance and numbing, avoidance and numbing. And we don't need to judge it. That's not going to help, because remember that even in the most extreme situations, like the girl who was self-mutilating, there was actually an intelligence there. Now, granted, that intelligence had limited access to information, and that intelligence was operating inside a no-win situation where there was no higher self present, either in the girl or her parents or her family. Well, it's not that it wasn't present, but it was pushed out of the driver's seat, right? They were blended with these other parts, with these other protectors and exiles. So the higher self respects the free will of those parts. And those parts do have free will, and they have a lot of power. So we can respect that they have good reason for doing what they're doing. So the girl in the initial example, she's self-mutilating so she doesn't go crazy. She's self-mutilating because she's in a no-win situation. Nobody's showing up being self-led. Nobody's showing up with the higher self energy. She can't find it in herself. And indeed, in her situation, it probably would have been dangerous to be self-led. I mean, if you're dealing with an abuser who's literally riddled with demons, somebody who's willing to incestuously abuse their own relative, bringing in the higher self is not going to be very pleasing to your abuser, right? Because they are totally locked into that scenario. So what's happened for a lot of us as children, the higher self is, attempts to come through. We actually get punished for it. I mean, even in much more benign situations, like I know this happened to me before, like in a school situation, maybe the teacher was incorrect or not being self-led, or someone in an authority position was kind of out of line. And you can say something from a self-led place, but because in the sort of mundane plane societal structure, they're above you, or they're an authority above you, they don't take kindly to that. And you get punished, for being smart-mouthed or being fresh or whatever, talking back. So many of us, especially, people in this group, certainly there's got to be a lot of you who are way showers here because you had the courage to even connect into a group like this and be willing to realize, like, hey, I might be part of the problem. I might need to do some inner work, right? So you're at the cutting edge, right? A lot of us, we did attempt self-leadership in one way, shape, or form, and we got punished for it. So that only exacerbates this addiction to the suffering, because the people who are supposed to be guiding us to this were being led by firefighters, managers, or exiles, right? So many of us learned directly and specifically that it wasn't safe to be self-led. So you might even need to do a whole healing about that. I remember I did a session once with a woman who had literally never fully physically grounded into this reality. And at the time, she was at least in her mid to late 20s, at least. I'm not sure exactly how old she was. So, we went through this, and I just negotiated with her protectors about what would happen when she grounds in, what would happen if she doesn't like it, will it be safe? One of the things also that's important with negotiating is asking these parts of you, the managers and firefighters, how old they think you are. So I had a client the other day who, I believe he's in his early 70s, and he had a part that believed in present time he was still either 7 or 11 years old. I think it was 7 years old. This part of him thought he was still 7 years old. So if he thinks he's still 7 years old, and I come to him talking about all this agency he has and all this power to heal himself, it's going to be hard for him to hear that, because he's actually identified as being 7. So when you ask this question to these protector parts, well, how old do you think I am right now? They may say 7, 14, 22, 5, 3, 1 month old, who knows? When that happens, you can just very gently kind of give them an overview and just show them all the stuff that has happened since that age. And then show them yourself in present time. Show them that you're an adult now. You don't contact that abuser anymore. Or if that abuser somehow is still in your life, you have the power to stay away from them. You're safe from them now. And you show these parts that we're in a new situation now, and it's actually okay. Along the same lines, sometimes external circumstances make it that it actually is not safe to do this work, right? So if you're currently living in an abusive situation, again, accessing this very vulnerable aspects of yourself, or trying to bring in the higher self if someone's being abusive, sometimes it can really backfire. So one of the things that I assess if the protective system of a client is really intense and just resisting the healing, I just ask, are you in a safe place right now? What's going to happen after this session? Are you going to be around somebody who's triggering? Are you going to be around people who are abusive? It might not be safe to do this work. Maybe we can do a different piece of work today that's not as triggering, that's, more not as deep. Because there's always something you can do. And even if you can't get to the exiled part, if you just work with the protectors, you can do entire sessions just helping these protectors. Because remember, even though some of their behaviors are extreme when they're unhealthy, they have a good reason for it. And they are really suffering. Your managers and firefighters aren't going to be able to fully release their pain until you heal the exiles. Because remember, their whole job is to stay numb or, distracted because you don't want to feel this. Once this is healed, they don't have to do that anymore. So let's just briefly talk about what happens when it's healed. So we already talked about when the exiles are healed, they go from, co-creating like repeated abusive situations to creating magical, beautiful, delightful, surprising, lovely situations, because they really have that power. So once that happens and they can release their fears about being overwhelmed by this pain, once this pain has been transmuted and this is now joy coming from this part of you, your firefighters, instead of like engaging in numbing activities, their job can become fun, socializing, making sure you get out, making sure you connect with other people, making sure you let loose sometimes and kick up your heels, making sure you do stuff that feels good, that you can have healthy sexual relations instead of just having sex to stay numb. You can have a glass of wine because it tastes good instead of drinking 2 bottles of wine to knock yourself out, etc. The managers, when they're unhealthy, they're workaholics, they're emotionally abusive, mentally abusive, they're judgmental even towards you, towards other people. So instead of that extreme role, your managers can take charge of organizing your space so it feels fresh and clean. They can take charge of making sure, you're cleaning the house once a week so the energy's good and it helps you manifest even better things. So just keep in mind that these parts, we usually start off learning about them unhealthy because in most people they're very unhealthy. But once you repeat this over and over again and you keep bringing in the higher self, all these parts can take on new roles that are just really delightful. So they do have a healthy aspect. Now, at the end of the day, the question often arises, well, what is the end goal, right? Am I going to no longer have parts? Well, I'll become one unified field of consciousness with no splits whatsoever. As a human being, that's pretty much impossible, and it's not necessary because, as I said, once these parts become healed and unburdened, then they can engage in the fun of being human. Because again, life is not just suffering. Life is also joy, right? Life is also exciting and expansive and creative. So you will still have different parts. It's just that they're healthy. So let me give a healthy example, right? The part of you that you're blended with when you're hanging out with your sweet, let's say very religious grandmother, is a very different part of you than the part of you that's going to come forward when you're on a hot date with somebody who's really sexy to you. And there's a very different part of you that's going to come forward if you're speaking with your 4-year-old child, right? These are different aspects of us, different flavors of our personality, and that's okay. The issue is who is in the driver's seat, who's kind of controlling who's coming forward. And if we want to say there's a goal, the goal is to get the higher self in the driver's seat. Most of us, it's one of these. There's some people where the exile is in the driver's seat and they're like, very suicidal, very depressed, kind of like, that emo type of, dark and heavy, in sadness, in despair. That does happen as well. So you can be blended with any of these parts of your consciousness. When you're healthy, there's nothing wrong with blending with the inner child that's like full of light and joy and creativity and hopefulness and trust and love. There's nothing wrong with blending with a firefighter who's like, we really need to get out this weekend and connect with people. Let's go to that festival, There's nothing wrong with blending with a manager who's like, if we organized our house better, it would feel so good. Let's clear out some of the stuff we don't need and really like mop the floors and freshen up the house. There's nothing wrong with any of that. The key is that the higher self becomes like the anchor point, the center point, who's got its hands on the steering wheel. So if we were to switch to human design language now, you'd be following strategy and authority. So when the higher self is in the driver's seat, you're a projector waiting to be invited. You're a manifester who informs before you initiate. You're a generator waiting to respond. You're a reflector who's sampling and waiting 28 days to make a decision. And then the inner authority is the center of your being where the higher self speaks most clearly. So for example, me, I'm a sacral generator. So my higher self gives me the yes or no from my gut. If you are emotionally defined, your higher self is going to go through an emotional wave before you come to like the eye of the storm, the still centered place where you can make your decision, etc. So that's where the self-leadership comes in. But that doesn't mean that I'm like some kind of stone-faced person with like no personality and no character, and I'm just always pure compassion, you know. There's going to be some flavor and personality in front of it. I'm still playing the Michelle Gaza character. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that so long as like the heart of it, the anchor of it is this higher self energy. Anytime the higher self is not doing that and I get skewed and I blend too much with one part or another, I'm polarizing, right? So I'm not integrated. But just really notice how our culture encourages this polarity. Good guys, bad guys, winners, losers, us, them, men, women, black, white. Do those separations exist? Is there such a thing as a man and a woman? Yeah. But with higher self, that doesn't become something that's polarized and separate. It's still all integrated because from the higher self perspective, that man over there is me. He's got a higher self just like me. My higher self and his higher self, they resonate at the same place. I meet someone of a different race, that's me in a different form. That's another expression of source. I'm this expression, they're that expression, right? So the flavor is still there, the difference is still there, the excitement is still there of these different manifestations of source, but the baseline kind of maybe invisible, but really it's not invisible. Once you start to see this resonance, you can see when people are self-led. The base of it is the higher self. The base of it is source consciousness, having a human experience of being Michelle or Jess or Tia or Z or Ayana or Jenny or Alana, etc. Okay, so I think that that pretty much covers it. Let me just look through my notes quickly to see if there was any point that I missed. And if there's anyone actually still here who has a question, feel free. Yeah, I think I've got it all. So I will just mention, I have to go in and actually plug it into our system, but I am offering a discount for people who participate in this summit. The discount is not just for my services, it's also for Kayvon's human design readings. He agreed to that. So we're doing 11% off, and the code is just 11 in capital letters, spelling it out, E-L-E-V-E-N, right, 11. So that'll give you 11% off any private sessions. Coming up soon, I was anticipating September, but it looks like it might be October. We're having our meeting soon to negotiate our start date. Kayvon, myself, and Z Earth Star Healer will be starting another round of our New Earth Self-Leadership Academy. So it's now a 9-month program. You can learn all the details of what is offered on our website, which is www.activationcoaching.com. We go through in depth what I spoke about today, which is this internal family systems approach to shamanic healing. There's actually going to be 4 webinars just on this approach. At the end of it, you're really going to feel confident that you can do this work on yourself. Of course, there is never anything wrong with asking for help or support doing this work. I've been working with IFS since 2007. So what is that, like 12 years? I actually am working with a coach this summer because there's certain things that my protectors are trying to avoid so hard that I had to pay a lot of money to a coach to help me get to those things, right? So there's nothing wrong with needing support. Being self-led doesn't mean that you do it alone. But it's really important for us to present you with these tools so that you know that there is a lot you can do on your own. So as you go through this program, we're basically teaching you how to use these tools on yourself. So we start with the shamanic healing, then we teach you a lot about human design, then we go into the lucid dreaming and out-of-body experiences, astral travel, and those components are all Kayvon. And then after that, there's the advanced light work with Z or Star Healer. This is not a certification program, so I'm not certifying you to be an IFS therapist. I'm not even a therapist. I'm a coach. I'm a shaman. We're not certifying you to be a human design reader. This is more about people who want to do the work on themselves. So this is for self-healing to establish your own self-leadership. Now, it just so happens that people who graduate from the program are interested in these things, and they may very well go on to do them themselves. So like Angela Rose, who presented the other day, she graduated from our program, and she's now training, studying, becoming a human design consultant herself. But I just want to be clear about that. This is really for people who want to do the work on themselves, and they want support in going really deep and getting super empowered, super confident, and just breaking through a lot of the barriers. So we do have a secret Facebook group, so no one can access it or even find it unless they're in the group. And you get a lot of individual coaching sessions one-on-one. So you get the benefits of both the group work and the one-on-one private work. And then we also do webinars every 2 weeks. For me, all of my webinars are live. With Kayvon and Z, it's a combination of live and pre-recorded. But there's always, with every modality, you have at least 2 options or maybe more to have a live call where you can do a Q&A and get, questions answered in a group setting. So again, our website is activationcoaching.com, and I invite you to check out on our homepage. There's just a detailed listing of everything the school involves. Our email is activationcoaching@gmail.com. So I welcome your comments and feedback, or of course in the comments here. That'll be easy for me to access. And so this was a major topic. Like, I'm basically giving you like 8 weeks of training in an hour and a half. So I hope it was helpful. And I know this is a lot of information, but I just really wanted to elucidate these main points. Number one, we're not just here to suffer. And when the Buddha said life is suffering, that's not literally what the translation is meant to be. Number two, the addiction to suffering is really an addiction to avoidance and being numb. Not because we're bad people, not because we're weaklings, but just because we haven't been taught how to access the courageousness of the higher self that allows us to stop avoiding, to start feeling, and actually healing. There has really been a organized effort to keep us from this power. So I really want to say that so people realize we don't have to beat ourselves up. We don't have to judge ourselves for being addicted to suffering. I have addictions to suffering. We all do. Because getting out of it is real tricky. But if you're ready to get past that addiction and to really go into this deep healing, I warmly invite you to consider joining the school, because it's incredibly effective, and you're going to be able to clear out stuff that you thought would never be cleared out and access levels of your empowerment that are very profound, so that you can go on to do like the fun work that we're here to do. Yeah, we're at the end of the Kali Yuga. It's a really tough time, but at the same time, this is also a time in the evolution of the species where you can get incredible awakening and empowerment because things are so wild, right? So it's a really special time. We've got all this ascension happening. So joining the school is really going to break open levels of the game. I mean, we're literally giving you cheat codes, especially with the human design. That's literal cheat codes. If there's any gamers out there, like, you know the difference. Like, if you ever played GTA, regular GTA versus God mode is a totally different game. And that kind of brings me to one of the things I was meditating on as well. One of the reasons we're also addicted to suffering is a lot of us came here to experience being asleep, because there's certain things that you can only experience and understand when you're asleep because of that contrast, right? We come here for contrast. So we're not here to be stuck in suffering, but we are here to experience contrast. Sometimes people aren't ready to get out of that experience of contrast. Sometimes people aren't ready to be awake. So trying to wake someone up like that is like walking backwards through a haunted house and telling everybody you see, oh guys, don't be afraid. They're just in costumes. That ghost isn't even real. That zombie, that's just Joe from down the street in Halloween makeup. None of this is even real, guys. You don't need to be afraid. Well, they're in the haunted house to have the experience of being afraid and shocked and terrorized, right? For whatever reason, right? So if you're going in and saying, oh, well, none of this is even real, it's like nobody wants to hear that. They want the experience. And that's the same for the game of life. You know, sometimes people are here and they want to have the experience of contrast. They want to have the experience of being asleep. And you can actually really irritate people if you try to wake them out of that. So fortunately, we don't have to worry about waking other people up. Once we do this work inside, we are going to naturally be gravitating to experiences where there's other people who share this desire to be self-led. And every time we do these little pieces of work, every time we release an exile from pain, and every time one of our exiles is like frolicking in the garden instead of living in a dungeon of horror, we're etching away one layer of pain in the pain body of the planet. So every time we do this, we're helping the collective. So the quickest, fastest way to heal the world, to fix the world, is to go inside and to heal ourselves. If you want to see those children released from Trump's, border programs, go release the inner children inside of you that you're neglecting. Next time you feel tempted to complain about politics and get wrapped up in that drama, it might be time to look in the mirror and see how you are neglecting your own children and not serving them and not showing up for them. All these things in the outer world, it's our addiction to being numb, our addiction to avoiding, okay? And we can get very drawn into that and very self-righteous about it because we have a lot of programming about how important it is to march and rally and vote and fight against these things. All of that stuff is copping out from the real work and taking us away from our real power, which is inside, connecting with the higher self. There's nothing that's more powerful than that. There's nothing that's more powerful than showing up with your higher self present. I promise you, there's literally nothing you can do that's more powerful than that. Regardless of what your managers and firefighters and even your exiles may think, regardless of what the managers and firefighters of the people around you may say, or your teachers or parents or clergymen or whatever, okay? Just keep in mind a lot of people are blended with parts that are desperate because they're disconnected from the higher self, and you can't really take what they're saying as gospel, right? Connect within. If you know your human design, follow your strategy and authority, connect with the higher self, heal your inner children, and that's how we create the world that we want to see. That's how we usher in ascension and 5D and above living. If we don't do that, I'm just talking mechanically now, okay? Literally, the metaphysics dictates that if we don't bring this in and heal this whole dynamic, they're just going to keep recreating the trauma and the suffering, hoping that somehow this time it will be different. They're just going to keep recreating the numbing, and it's going to escalate because it's going to take more and more to keep you numb. When these exiles don't get heard, they just get bigger. So they're going to get bigger and they're going to get bigger. The Democrats will get more extreme. The Republicans will get more extreme. It's just mechanical. So until you do this work, you don't have a right to expect it to not look like that outside, because what's happening outside is only a reflection of the fact that you're not getting in here. And that's just metaphysics. That's not about what we deserve or don't deserve or how things should be. It's mechanical. It's just the mechanics of how the metaphysics work. So if you feel like you need some support and you'd like to try this method, I encourage you to use the code 11. I'll put some links in the comments for how you can get in touch with us and how you can sign up for sessions. So thank you so much. I've gone on a really long time, but as you can see, there's a lot of layers to this topic. So I hope that was helpful. And thanks again to Tia and for everybody else who participated. I really appreciate being invited to be a part of this.